Thomas Granger lived alone at the edge of the high plains, tucked deep in a dry valley most folks wouldn't dare ride into. His cabin stood sturdy but weather-worn, a squat shelter of pine logs blackened by years of wind and sun. It was a half-day's ride to the nearest town, and longer still if you took the trail that wound through the Badlands. Out here, the silence settled thick, like dust on old memories that Thomas tried hard not to stir. Once, long ago, he'd had a wife with kind eyes and a boy who chased grasshoppers across the pasture. He'd built this place with calloused hands and wide dreams of raising cattle under the open sky. But the frontier was unforgiving, and dreams didn't last long. His family was gone now, claimed by a crossfire in a conflict that wasn't theirs. Since then, Thomas had spoken mostly to his horse and the wind. He kept his fields from overgrowing, fixed his fences, tended to a few head of cattle, and tried not to think too hard about the past. The bottle helped some nights. Other times, it it was on one of those dusky evenings, with the sun dipping low in gold across the hills, that he found her. Thomas had gone down to the creek to fill a bucket when he noticed something unusual near the reeds. A dark shape, half hidden by dead leaves and tangled grass. He approached slowly, boots crunching the dry earth. It wasn't until he stood over her that he realized what he was seeing. A girl, barely more than a child, native. Her face was smeared with dirt and blood, her breathing shallow. She wore torn buckskin, and her ribs moved in sharp pained jolts with each breath. A gash ran from her side down to her hip, crusted with dried blood and buzzing with flies. Thomas stood frozen. His first instinct was caution. Helping her might mean trouble. Hell, it might mean death. If her people found her here, in the cabin of a white man, they'd assume the worst. And if the lawmen found out, they wouldn't look kindly on it either. But as he turned to leave, he heard a sound like a wounded bird. A soft, broken whimper. Barely a breath, but enough. He looked down again. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused, full of pain and fear and something else pleading. He couldn't turn away. Not again. Thomas knelt and slid his arms beneath her, lifting her gently. She was lighter than he expected. Bones and bruises and dried blood. He carried her the half-mile back to the cabin, heart pounding with every step. The sky darkened above him, stars blinking into life one by one, uncaring. Inside, he laid her on the bed, his wife's old bed, unused for years. He stoked the fire, boiled water, and washed her wound with careful, trembling hands. The slash was deep, maybe made by a blade, not an animal. He stitched it as best he could with an old sewing kit, muttering reassurances she couldn't understand. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Her lips were cracked, her skin was burning. He gave her sips of water, wiped sweat from her brow, and sat beside her through the night, watching over her like a man guarding the last flame in a long winter. Just before dawn, as her fever broke and her eyes finally stayed open for more than a blink, she whispered a single word, soft, broken, but clear, Ayanna, and then she slipped into sleep. Thomas leaned back in the creaky wooden chair, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know what the name meant, but he knew this much. Everything in his life had just changed. The girl didn't speak for days. Thomas wasn't sure if it was fear, shock, or simply the way of her people. But Ayanna remained silent, watching, listening, healing. She moved like a deer in the brush, always alert, never quite relaxed, even while lying under a warm quilt by the fire. Her eyes followed Thomas wherever he went, not with malice, but with deep, quiet suspicion. He didn't blame her. The frontier was no friend to her kind. Settlers feared natives. Natives hated settlers. Blood had been spilled on both sides for too long, and no one remembered how it had all started. But out here, in this lonely pocket of land, Thomas had made his choice. She was hurt. She needed care. And that was all that mattered. He didn't try to talk much. He figured words wouldn't help anyway. Instead, he did what he always did: tended to the cattle, chopped firewood, cleaned the guns, cooked simple meals. In the evenings, he read aloud from an old beat-up Bible. Not because he thought she'd understand it, but because the sound of a human voice might offer some comfort. To his surprise, she began to respond not with speech, but with movement. When he handed her a cup of water, she took it without flinching. When he left her food, she ate. One morning, he found the quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, and the wooden floor swept clean. Another day, he came back from checking the fence line to find her carefully tending the fire, adding logs and fanning the flames like she'd done it 1,000 times. They never exchanged more than a nod. But trust, Thomas figured, didn't always need words. Still, the silence hung heavy. He'd catch her staring out the window sometimes, toward the horizon, the hills. Her eyes would harden, and her jaw would tighten, like she was waiting for something, or someone. He didn't ask. He knew better. But he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she'd run from wasn't far behind. Late one evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Thomas noticed her clothing lying near the hearth. He'd set her tattered buckskin aside after she first arrived, figuring it needed mending. Now, curiosity got the better of him. He picked up the fabric, brushing off dust and ash. That's when he saw it. Stitched along the hem were symbols, delicate and intricate, unlike anything he'd seen on plains, warriors, or trading post goods. They were tribal, yes, but not common. These were ceremonial markings, woven with meaning and care. Whoever Ayanna was, she wasn't just a runaway or a scout. She belonged to someone important, maybe a chief's daughter, maybe something more. He placed the clothes back down and said nothing when she took them later that night. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, whispering in a language only ghosts remembered. The next few days passed in a kind of rhythm. She spoke not a word, but her presence became part of the cabin, as if the silence between them had been made into a kind of pact, fragile but real. Thomas no longer felt alone in the way he used to. He still didn't smile much, but sometimes he'd catch her watching him, curious, maybe even amused, and he'd feel something shift inside a memory of what it was like to be seen. Then, on the sixth night, as he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand and the stars blinking into the deep indigo sky, he saw them, dark shapes, figures on horseback, motionless on the ridge above the valley. Watching, they didn't move. They didn't call out, just stood there silent and still like shadows waiting for the sun to rise. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the ridgeline above the valley. The riders hadn't moved. They stayed there like statues, blending into the dark like they were carved from the hills themselves. He knew what they were, warriors, and he knew what they wanted. Yana. When the first light of dawn spilled across the valley floor, the silhouettes came alive. Horses shifted, spears caught the morning sun. There were more of them, now dozens, men in war paint, silent, grim, determined. They lined the hills in a wide crescent, a half circle that wrapped around his land like a noose, slowly tightening. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching on dry earth. His shotgun rested casually against the doorframe, but he made no move toward it yet. He didn't want to fight, not if there was another way. He saw movement from the tree line below the ridge, one rider breaking off, making his way down the slope. Ayanna appeared behind him, barefoot, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Her shoulder had healed enough to let her move freely, but her face was pale. Her eyes locked on the approaching rider, and something in her changed. She didn't flinch. She didn't hide. She stepped forward. The rider stopped 30 paces away and dismounted, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing eyes and a face that bore the weight of leadership. He carried no weapon openly, though Thomas had no doubt he could kill with bare hands if need be. His voice was like gravel dragged over stone. When he finally spoke, "You have something that belongs to us." Thomas kept his voice even. "She came here I patched her up. That's all. You kept her," the man said coldly. "You trespassed." Ayanna stepped forward. Then, her voice sudden and sharp in the quiet morning. "I ran," she said. "He did not take me." The warrior's eyes flicked to her, at first, unreadable. Then something shifted just slightly. "Recognition, Ayanna," he said, softer now. Thomas looked between them. "You know him." She nodded slowly. "Tukup, my brother." The man Tukamat did not smile. His face remained carved in stone, but the weight in his shoulders seemed to change. "You were to be wed," he said, "to Chief Nahu's son. You vanished. We thought you were taken, killed." "I'd rather die than belong to them," she said, "and they tried to make it so. I was wounded by Nahu's riders. She motioned toward Thomas. He found me. He could have let me die. He didn't." Silence hung between them, thick as the heat rising from the dirt. Tukoma looked at Thomas. And why would a white man risk his life for a native girl? Thomas didn't answer right away. He didn't have a simple reason. Not one that would make sense to a man like Tukoma, but he spoke the truth. "Because I've lost enough people already. I wasn't going to let it happen again." Tukoma stared at him, measuring him. Behind him, the line of warriors remained silent, bows in hand, rifles resting across saddles, eyes watching. A single word from their leader would bring fire and death down on the little cabin in the valley. Then, after a long pause, Tukoma said, "You will come to the council fire. Tonight, we speak. Then we decide." Without waiting for an answer, he turned and walked back to his horse. In minutes, the warriors began to retreat, slipping back into the hills like shadows at sunrise. Thomas let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ayanna stood beside him, unmoving. He looked down at her. "Council fire?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "They won't kill you. Not yet." And for the first time, she almost smiled. That evening, the valley took on an eerie stillness, like the land itself was holding its breath. The sun dropped low, casting gold over the ridge, and the shadows stretched long across the dry ground. Thomas rode up slowly, Ayanna beside him on a borrowed horse, both of them following the winding trail toward the firelight ahead. They crested a rise and saw the gathering below. Dozens of warriors circled around a large fire at the center of a clearing. Elder men and women sat nearby, draped in ceremonial robes, feathers and beads glinting in the fire's glow. Horses stood tethered, silent, as if they too knew the weight of what was about to unfold. Thomas dismounted, his boots landing with a soft crunch. He carried no rifle, no pistol, only his hat and a steady expression. Ayanna walked beside him, not as a child needing protection, but as someone stepping back into her own skin. Tacoma waited at the edge of the circle, flanked by 2 elders. His eyes found Thomas immediately. "Come," he said. "You will speak." Thomas nodded. They entered the circle, the fire warm against their faces. Ayana sat just behind him, close enough to be heard if she wished to speak. The others gathered tighter, murmuring in their native tongue, some glancing at Thomas with quiet hostility. One man muttered a word Thomas couldn't understand, but from the way Tacoma turned and snapped something back at him, he got the sense it wasn't a compliment. The fire cracked and popped as silence fell. Tacoma spoke first. "This man, a settler, found my sister wounded and alone. He brought her back to life. Yet he is also part of the people who have brought death to ours. For every kindness, there has been cruelty. For every hand offered, another strikes with iron." He turned to Thomas. "Speak." Thomas cleared his throat, the firelight dancing across the rough lines of his face. "I didn't take your sister. I found her, left for dead near my creek. I had no idea who she was, just that she was hurt, and I'd seen too much death to ignore another one." One of the elders spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Why would you care? Many of your kind would have left her, or worse." Thomas looked at her. "Because I lost my wife and son in a raid. Years ago. It was bad. I didn't know who attacked, only that it was over in minutes. I buried them on my land and drank myself stupid for 3 months. I thought I hated every native face I saw after that. But hate doesn't heal anything. It just rots you out from the inside." He paused. The fire crackled. "When I saw her lying there, I thought maybe I could stop something bad from happening for once. Maybe I could do one damn thing right." The circle was quiet. Then Ayana spoke, her voice steady. "He treated me with more care than my own people. Who would have traded me like cattle for peace with a rival chief? I would have bled to death if he hadn't found me. He gave me food, warmth, safety. He never touched me, never demanded anything." Tacoma looked at his sister, eyes full of conflict. He turned back to the elders. "She is of the Bear clan," he said. "Her blood is sacred. Her will must be honored." Some warriors shifted uncomfortably. One stood. "Too many of our brothers have died at settler hands. Now we break bread with one." An elder raised his hand. "Blood brings blood," he said, voice cracked with age. "But what brings life? Maybe mercy is harder than war. Maybe that's why it matters." The fire flared as silence returned. Tacoma looked at Thomas, eyes narrowing. "Then we will not spill blood tonight. But understand, trust is not freely given. It is earned. The sun will rise. We will see where it shines." With that, the meeting ended. Thomas and Ayana left in silence, riding back down into the valley. But Thomas knew this was far from over. The fire from the council still smoldered in Thomas's mind when he returned to the cabin. Ayana rode beside him in silence, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the torchlight behind them. Something about the ride back felt different, heavier, like a calm before a storm he couldn't see, but could feel in his bones. The fragile peace had held for now, but out here, peace was always a borrowed thing. Never owned. By the time they reached the cabin, the moon was high and pale. Ayana moved gingerly as she slid off the horse. Her shoulder still hadn't fully healed, though she tried to hide it. Thomas offered to help her inside, but she shook her head and walked in on her own. He admired that. The girl had fire in her. Thomas stayed up after she went to bed. He sat in the rocking chair near the window, boots off, shotgun across his knees. He wasn't expecting trouble. Not tonight, but old instincts die slow. The world was too quiet, the wind too still. Even the coyotes weren't calling around midnight. He heard it, a crunch. Not loud, just enough. Then another. He stood without making a sound, stepping barefoot across the creaking floorboards. He opened the cabin door. Just a hair. A blur slammed into him. They crashed to the ground. Thomas's back hitting hard wood, the breath knocked clean out of him. A blade slashed through the air, missing his neck by inches. He wrestled wildly, catching glimpses of painted skin and wild eyes. Ayana screamed behind him. The attacker twisted, trying to break free, but Thomas grabbed his wrist. The blade cut across his forearm, hot pain flashing through him. He let go. The man surged toward Ayana. "No!" Thomas roared, diving for his shotgun. The man reached Ayana, grabbing her by the injured arm and yanking her to her feet. She cried out, knees buckling. Then the man turned. Blade raised toward Thomas. Again. Click. Thomas raised the shotgun. Boom. The shot lit the cabin like lightning. The blast hit the man square in the chest and sent him crashing into the doorframe. He slumped forward and collapsed, motionless. Smoke drifted through the room. The gun's echo faded into the valley like a dying scream. Thomas dropped the weapon and rushed to Ayana. She was on the floor, clutching her shoulder, blood seeping fresh through her bandage. "Hold still," he said, voice low and urgent. "You're all right. Just stay with me." She gritted her teeth, but didn't cry. Her breathing slowed. "Kiwa," she said, voice shaking. "That was Kawa. He's Tacoma's cousin. He's always hated white men. Said peace made warriors weak." Thomas didn't need to hear more. He already knew. This hadn't been justice. It had been revenge. Outside, he heard galloping many horses. Torches flickered in the dark. The tribe had heard the shot. Within moments, warriors encircled the cabin. Tacoma pushed through the front line, face tight with fury. What happened? He barked. Thomas stepped out, hands raised, his arm still bleeding. One of yours broke the council? He came for her. Tried to kill us both. Tacoma's eyes dropped to the still warm body of Kella, his jaw clenched. Ayana stepped into the doorway, pale, but standing. He tried to take me back. Said you were weak. Brother. Said he'd do what you wouldn't. Tacoma closed his eyes. When he opened them, the fire in them had changed not anger, but sorrow. He turned to his warriors. This man saved her twice. He is no threat to us. Kiwa acted on his own. There was no cheering, just nods, acceptance. As the warriors rode off, carrying Kiwa's body back to the hills, Thomas helped Ayana back to bed. She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. Would you have done it again? Thomas paused, then nodded. Every time, and as he watched the torchlights vanish into the darkness, he realized something. For the first time in years, he had someone worth fighting for. Dawn came slow, casting long shadows across the valley, painting the hills in soft gold and dusty rose. Smoke from last night's fire curled gently above the cabin roof, drifting lazily into the morning air. Everything was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. The emptiness that had ruled this land for years, but something settled, something earned. Inside, Thomas moved through the cabin with a quiet purpose. His arm was bandaged, his ribs sore from the fight with Kella, but he worked anyways, sweeping the floor, boiling water, cleaning the shotgun. Habit, ritual, life going on. Ayana stirred in the bed, blinking against the early light filtering through the window. Her wound had stopped bleeding, and the fever hadn't returned. That was a mercy. She sat up slowly, the blankets falling from her shoulders, revealing the tightly wrapped bandage over her collarbone. You should rest, Thomas said without looking up. She ignored him and stood anyway. I'm tired of resting. He smirked at that but didn't argue. She crossed the room, barefoot, and sat across from him at the rough-hewn table. For a while, they said nothing, just sipped coffee and listened to the birds start up in the trees. Finally, she spoke. He would have killed us both. Thomas nodded. Yeah, he would have. You saved me again. He shrugged. I reckon we're even now. She gave a small smile. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her since the day he found her bleeding in the dirt. And it wasn't just thanks, it was gratitude. It was understanding. Later that morning, a rider appeared on the ridge. Tacoma, alone this time. No war paint, no weapons, just a man on a horse, carrying a white cloth tied to the end of a branch. Ayana stepped out first. Thomas followed Tacoma, dismounted, and walked forward. He looked tired but calm. I came to speak to my sister, he said. Thomas nodded and stepped back. The siblings sat on a log beneath the shade of a pine. They spoke in their own tongue, quietly. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. He watched their faces, saw the pain, the apologies, the old wounds healing slowly, like earth growing back after fire. After a while, Ayana stood and walked back to the cabin. Tacoma followed. She may stay, if she chooses, he said, looking Thomas in the eye. But if she ever calls, I will come. Thomas met his gaze. That's fair. Tacoma looked around the land at the hills, the trees, the sky. This is a hard place for peace, he said. But maybe, not impossible. Then he turned and rode off, disappearing into the morning mist. That evening, Thomas brought out the second rocking chair from the back room. It had been his wife's. Once, for years, it had sat under a tarp in the corner. Now, he dusted it off and placed it beside his own on the front porch. Ayana sat down slowly, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. They didn't speak much that night, just watched the stars appear, one by one. In the distance, coyotes called again. This time, the sound didn't feel lonely. It felt like part of the land, alive, wild, and enduring. Thomas glanced over at Ayana. You ever think about leaving? She shook her head. Not yet, he nodded. Then we'll make it work. The prairie wind rolled over the porch. The world was still broken in places, still scarred, but tonight, there was peace. Not the kind drawn on treaties or bought with guns, but the kind made between two people who had both come close to the edge. Stepped back, and as the first stars shimmered over the high plains, Thomas Granger wasn't a lonely man anymore.